Timeline of the American Curriculum. Often, when I need to start thinking about a big idea, I begin with a dictionary. I know what curriculum means to me, but I wanted to see what Merriam and Webster had to say. According to them, a curriculum, a noun, is the subjects comprising a course of study in a school or college. From the Latin word currere, which means to run a course, as in a course that a person would follow in a race. I find it interesting that the origins of the word curriculum come from a verb. This fits in with my personal definition of curriculum better than a noun. To me, a curriculum is something that students do, rather than a thing, such as a textbook. I started my timeline with the publication of the National Education Association's Committee of 10 report published in 1893. At the time, the chairman of the Committee of 10 was Charles Eliot, one of the most influential humanists in the education field. This group of educators was focused on educating the whole child, reason, morals, and the like, not just cognition. The report in 1893 decidedly had this influence. The report did give structure and organizations to the high school curriculum that was much needed. It laid out 4 different courses of study for secondary students. At the same time, it was careful to warn educators in schools that these subjects should not be taught differently depending on the students that were taking them. Every student, the report emphasized, regardless of whether they will attend college or not, was entitled to the best practices of education. Education for life is education for college, the authors were careful to point out. To me, the publication of this report and the subsequent criticisms start the long history of the debate of the American curriculum. John Dewey opened the doors of his laboratory school in Chicago just a few years after the publication of the report. Dewey's school, the development of its curriculum, and the many positions he took on education theory in the future have become a great influence on education today. To think that schools were best when treated like a miniature community where the students' experiences and backgrounds are used to enrich the social dynamics of the classroom is something that we see still emphasized today. On a personal level, this is one of the top pedagogical aspects of my teaching philosophy. Dewey is also known through his works to be a proponent of using interests of the child to guide the curriculum. He believed that educating the child could be done through integrating the subjects, which was a great departure from the educational leaders of the day. For example, William Torrey Harris believed that the 5 windows of the soul were a way to introduce children to intellectual concepts. However, Harris also believed that these windows were best taught independently from each other. Dewey believed that to do this was to do a disservice not only to the subject at hand, but also the child. In another important point of Dewey's philosophy that is prominent in today's educational landscape is the idea that learning is social. We see this in many different aspects of the classroom, from the way furniture is arranged to the addition of more and more group projects in school, and also in the standards that we use today. Looking at the bigger picture, Dewey, in his most famous work, Democracy in Education, published in 1916, spelled out that education, at its core, had a purpose of a person learning to command his own life and at the same time lead to social progress. I would be remiss if I didn't also mention one other educator that was practicing at this time. Jane Addams, also based in Chicago, was operating the Hull House to serve the immigrant community of the West Side. The school and daycare started as a service to the new class of working moms that developed during the Industrial Revolution. Addams was sympathetic to the poor and uneducated and wanted to provide support for them, just as it was needed most. The most significant thing I learned about Addams was her philosophy about the sacred time of childhood. She believed in the power of play and movement, something that is near to my heart. At this point in the Klebard book, I was feeling pretty great about the state of education philosophy. My personal beliefs are very much in line with the humanists, Dewey and Addams. However, all good things must come to an end, I suppose. Enter the social efficiency movement. During the Industrial Revolution and the turn of the century, the institution of family and church were felt to be in decline. Because they didn't seem to be having as much influence on people anymore, there was a movement that believed that schools should take their place. Edward Ross, the author of the book Social Control, published in 1901, was an outspoken leader of the efficiency movement. At its heart, the movement set to predetermine the future of students in societal roles and educate them accordingly. A rural farmhand had no use for Latin or higher level math. That would just be a waste. Ross's writing and rhetoric were bigoted at best, and ultimately he used education as a weapon to gain social control by replacing the family with doctrine directed by schools and teachers. Dewey, on the other hand, believed that the decline of the family unit could be supported by connections made between home and school. I think of all the educational theorists that we read about in the book, Ross is the one that was most disturbing to me. On one hand, I agree that teachers should be role models and can have a great influence on children. We should not, however, be a substitute for family. This, to me, lends itself to unwanted uniform population and ultimately to tyranny. Maybe it's the semantics of the phrase social control. Who decides what it's controlling? As a human, I don't want anyone to have control over me, and as a parent, I want to share our family beliefs with my child. Furthermore, as a teacher, I don't want the responsibility of controlling anyone's thoughts. Besides this overarching disagreement with control, I also don't agree with the basis of the efficiency movement. Why can't a farmhand learn geometry? What if exposing a child to something frivolous, such as physics, inspires them to continue studies or to think in a new way? I think in trying to be efficient, we run the risk of being limiting. As I read on, I was hoping to see the pendulum swing back toward Dewey and the humanists. I was disappointed to learn that the social efficiency movement was embraced and expanded. I really wasn't surprised. With the modernization of the factory and the economic success of the Industrial Revolution, why wouldn't the same philosophy be applied to schools? This approach was taken even a step further by Leonard Ayres when he developed his Index of Efficiency, which applied a well-known production metaphor to curriculum. John Bobbitt, at the same time, was espousing the idea that students should be educated, quote, according to his capabilities. In other words, factories are successful when they eliminate waste, so schools should be too. This, of course, lends itself to widespread discrimination of students based on social class, gender, and race. One lasting legacy we see from this period is the continued use of educational objectives. Bobbitt, 1924, said, "The first step in curriculum making is to decide what specific educational results are to be produced." Before Edward Thorndike entered the scene, it was thought that studying such subjects as Latin and geometry primed the mind for higher level thinking. Thorndike, in his theory of transfer of training, changed that, and in turn changed the curriculum development. Thorndike's experiments demonstrated that students who studied a subject were no better at applying that knowledge than those who didn't. This profoundly changed the way curriculum makers approach subjects. The focus now was on creating activities that could be directly applied to everyday life. Thorndike described the mind like a machine, working with many different connections. He proposed that native intelligence was what had the most influence on a person. This approach then ushered in the era of IQ scores. This, along with the development of the junior high school, was used to determine a child's capabilities and set them on a path of study in high school. Finally, after feeling rather oppressed myself when reading about the state of education and curriculum development, a point of light appeared. Our readings by W.E.B. Du Bois were inspirational and instructive. The quote on this slide gave me the chills. "Education must keep its broad ideals before it and never forget that it is dealing with souls and not with dollars." This shot made at the social efficiency educators and the white establishment was what I needed at this point in the journey. I feel like many of his writings are just as relative today when looked at through the lens of our education system. We know, although it is certainly better than in Du Bois' time, that people of color and the economically disadvantaged do not get the same education as white middle-class students. He says in Of the Training of Black Men that we hear that an education that encourages aspiration, that sets the loftiest ideals, and seeks as an end culture, and character, rather than breadwinning, is the privilege of white men and the danger and delusion of black. In other words, whites were allowed to dream, blacks can work. Personally, I have been exploring and being more aware of my own privilege lately, and this quote resonated with me. It is something that I will bring with me to my future classrooms. I think that every child should have the privilege of dreaming. At this point in the timeline, I'm going to jump ahead past the Project Method and Kilpatrick to the Great Depression. There was a general agreement that schools needed to address the social and economic problems of the times. A loud voice in the curriculum development world was George S. Counts. He railed against a system of education that fed the capitalistic economy that was responsible for the Depression. He felt that schools could be used as a tool to change the values that led to the economic collapse. This idea resonated with administrators but was short-lived. As the U.S. was gearing up to join World War II, any criticisms were framed as anti-American. Another interesting aspect of this time was the increase of number of youth enrolled in high school. With no jobs to be had, the sudden increase in the population of high school students presented schools with a problem: what to teach them. Overall, it forced high schools to develop programs that were interesting to many, but still prepared the select few for admission to college. A rethinking of the SAT, internships, and student evaluations were developed during this time. We still see some remnants of this today. The American schools played a role in our fight in World War II. Students were trained in first aid and consumer education. There was an effort to create and maintain a democratic morality. Vocational education turned more toward aeronautics and mechanics. The social efficiency movement reigned during this time. A child-centered approach to education was deemed soft, and to question and criticize the social structure was deemed unpatriotic. After all the work and effort to reorganize secondary education during the Depression, enrollment during the war years decreased. Students that did attend were put on two paths: academics, those destined for college, and vocational training. Reading about this time gave me the same feeling as the Industrial Revolution: disheartened and discouraged, but not surprised. Given that the feelings and trends changed with the wind, this approach seems logical. However, the wind shifted in the 1950s with fonts embossing and their theory of developing the core curriculum. They proposed that curriculum should be free from subject matter patterns and that subjects should be used to solve problems. How did students do this? Well, they proposed that subject matter should be integrated, a full circle back to Dewey. I'm inspired by this approach. I like the idea of teaching students in an integrated fashion, and I know I'm not alone. I think the winds are blowing this way again today. Hopefully, as educators, we don't have the same implementation problems as fonts embossing. And as a side note, the picture in this slide is a young man who is helping to demonstrate gun safety classes in the 1950s. I just thought this was a really great picture. At the end of the 50s, the end of the decade, we see that the launch of the space age as Sputnik lifted off. Schools changed focus to science and project-based learning. Are we in another space age right now? Possibly. STEM is the new Sputnik. Technology is moving fast and education is frantically trying to keep up. So far, I'm not sure we're doing a very good job. I think STEAM and STEM are good efforts. However, we need better teacher training and access to more resources, particularly in rural areas. How can a teacher be expected to teach quality information technology courses and computer coding when many parts of our country don't even have access to a broadband internet connection? During the construction of the timeline, I felt two specific instances of utter disappointment. First, during World War II and the defeat of the progressive education and its label as anti-American. Souls and not dollars ring so true for me here. Du Bois also said that freedom of mind is a human opportunity. Being able to think critically and digging deeper is part of that freedom. I was also so disappointed to learn about the failed efforts of fonts embossing and their integration of subjects as a mean to problem solve. To me, this is bubbling up again in our Common Core and project-based education programs today. However, I can't help but think how much farther along we would be if this was actually implemented in the 50s. Would we have longer learning periods for open-ended experiments instead of 50-minute classes? Would students be encouraged to use biology, chemistry, and geography to solve real-world problems rather than lug giant textbooks from class to class? A big idea connecting this entire timeline for me is theory versus practice. Even when an approach to education that seems promising is being talked about, putting that into practice is a different matter. In our pre-service training, we are exploring social means of education, different ways to evaluate students, and taking a student-centered approach. However, test scores are still determining our success as teachers, and students are bound by standards and at the mercy of trends, public trends, and sentiment. Much of the social efficiency movement is still evident in our schools today. I thought this book, In Creating a Timeline, was a wonderful exercise. As I get older, I'm learning how to appreciate history more, and as an educator, what could be more educative than learning the history of our craft? I keep thinking, those who do not learn from the past are doomed to repeat it.